Welcome back to the show. I'm so honored you decided to spend a few minutes with us here today. And I'm excited about today's guest. You will be as well. Dr. Jeremy Butler is a former police officer with over 20 years of martial arts experience. He's the author of the incredible book, Stop Resisting, and he trains law enforcement in control tactics, de-escalation, and mental performance across the country. A lot of stuff to talk about today. Dr. Butler, how are you doing, sir?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm great. So, I'll first talk about your book, and this is how you came on the radar. And I have to tell everybody listening, you need to go get it. I'm sure it's on all the bookstores. I got it on Amazon. It's called Stop Resisting, the Law Enforcement Officer's Guide to Proven Control Tactics, Less Lawsuits, and Building Community Trust Through Martial Arts. I couldn't think of a better subtitle because we've been kind of going round and round about how to deal with use of force and things like that. Because I'll tell you, modern law enforcement training, it's improved, but I'll never forget that those silly arm bars they taught me in the academy never worked. That silly plastic asp they gave me never really worked. And it wasn't until the tail end of my career when I got in an altercation with a little 95-pound spider-like woman who shouldn't have been able to be that spider-like, but I was trying to keep from essentially really hurting her, right? I was trying to do some things to not hurt her. And I confided in a friend of mine after that, Dr. Butler, and I said, do you have any suggestions? And he said, without hesitation, this wasn't my department. It wasn't my boss. It wasn't the academy. It was a friend of mine that said, you need to get into my jiu-jitsu gym. And I did that, and it changed my entire mentality of what we've been teaching law enforcement. And you've got incredible background in this stuff. I can't even pronounce most of your certifications and all your black belts. So I'll let you do the talking, but I know you spent several years in law enforcement. Tell us your experience with the training that was going on versus reality.
Well, I'll say there was I feel like in my background, a lot of, politics, I guess you can say. So it seems like some of the training was really more about checking the box and making sure you're, fulfilling, whatever.
Saying we did it, right? We did it. Don't forget, sign the pledge. We signed the pledge. It makes us better.
Exactly. So I definitely felt like I was seeing a lot of that in my experience, and that's not even calling out any particular department. I'm just saying overall in the law enforcement industry, I noticed that sort of trend. And so for me, that got a little frustrating. Being a martial artist, being someone with my background, it's always been my passion. I mean, I started when I was about 12 years old. So it's been many, many years of training. And so for me, it was like, I know that these things that we're doing could be better. I'm not saying it's all horrible. I'm just saying I didn't feel like we were positioning officers the way that we should be, considering what's being asked of law enforcement. So that's what really drove me to get into the research, get into the writing, and doing the work myself to help educate officers.
Well, one person changes everything. I call it, and that's what you're doing, because I'm amazed we're this far down in law enforcement in this country, and we don't see more of this. And I think a lot of it is, like you said, the old standard way of doing things, old types of training, politics, or Dr. Butler, what do you know? You're a rookie. We're not going to listen to you, and all the stuff. I have to imagine it was probably incredibly frustrating. But you just sit here and think to yourself, man, I know how to do this way better because of my training, but we're not going to call anybody out. But I know my experience is we don't listen to the right people oftentimes. We listen to people that maybe have been there for 100 years, and we listen to them. We don't actually tap into the expertise in our own agencies. And it's become, to me, very pressing. That's why I have you on the show, because we're not giving our officers the tools they need to overcome so much that they're dealing with today, right? I mean, it's not using a taser in every incident clearly doesn't work. And then many of these officers, that's the only tools they have. And I see a hesitation to go hands-on because they clearly don't have the tools to go hands-on. But that changes the game if they have the confidence and the training and tools to be able to quickly go hands-on, get handcuffs on people. Because last time I checked, I'm not trained like you, Dr. Butler, but these are the only things that can really kill you is this right here. And there's a ton of items, a ton of things we can do for our officers. And I guess I would just get straight to the point. So there's a ton of different martial arts out there. I'd love to see entire departments pick up on this. I know some of have, we'll talk about that, but as an individual officer like me, You know, because I'm thinking it was much easier to go into martial arts at age 12 than it was at age 50, right? I mean, so obviously I'm at a disadvantage, but I had to overcome a couple of things. And I bet it's the same thinking that officers have. Well, I've been here 28 years and I haven't, you know, had this or this happen. And how am I going to walk into this gym with a bunch of basically kids that know better than me? And how do I overcome it? Well, you got to stop your ego at the door, right? You've got to just know that your safety, and like you said in this book, you know, less lawsuits, better community trust is more important than your precious ego. But it changed the dynamics. Now, don't get me wrong. I was beat up by many a 12-year-olds in the jiu-jitsu gym. I still am today. But I knew more after 1 week than I knew after 20 plus years in law enforcement. So if somebody's out there and they're thinking to themselves, you know what? I don't think the old arm bar and wrist control in the basic academy where everybody says uncle really quick and it just seems to work and I check the box and I'm certified. In real life, that probably doesn't help. I need to quit just laying back and thinking this taser is going to work, because if taser tells us it works 40% of the time, that means 10% of the time. We know that. And where you're from, Dr. Butler, and cold weather, jackets and all that other stuff is going to prevent that. So we've sort of lied and fibbed to officers. We've told them this technology is the answer. But we haven't seen shootings go down. We haven't seen use of force go down. If anything, we've seen them increase in recent years. There's a low-hanging fruit out there that very few people want to talk about, and that is martial arts, which you're an expert at. So what would you tell an officer thinking about this? How do they start? Because there's a ton of different martial arts, right? I have a feeling which one you're going to say. How do they start when it comes to this?
Well, I think it starts with, you know, the power of Google, you know, find what's available in your area. But as far as my recommendations, I am a huge proponent for law enforcement of a grappling based art. For me, number one, being Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but that does not mean judo. It doesn't count. I think that would work well. Wrestling, you know, even an officer who wrestled in high school has a huge advantage in that regard. And why do I say a grappling based art? Because I feel anytime you have to put hands on a subject, you're essentially grappling with them if they resist you, right? So it is inevitable, right? The act of struggling with another person to seize hold of or control that person is grappling. So why not get good in that particular area? So for me, grappling based arts are my main recommendation. Now, if you could get into a area where you could also incorporate striking, that's good, because that's what's likely to happen with the subject. But arts like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, when you're at the right school, that's the one thing I appreciate about it, is that you can incorporate striking-based training without actually hurting each other, right? You can simulate strikes, and it gives you that awareness of what's going on. And one thing that I talk about in the book is, for example, if you were to find a place to train, let's say, for example, it's Jiu-Jitsu, even if you're at a sport-based school, right, where they don't do any striking, that doesn't mean you can't have that in your mind when you're training, right? So one of the places that I've trained throughout my life is a sport-based school. And we didn't really address striking, but whenever I rode, which is live grappling, whenever I went live, I was thinking right now, can he touch my face? Can he access my belt? Things of that nature. When that's fresh in my mind, I'm able to get the same benefit, if that makes sense.
No, I think part of the obstacle to many agencies is we're kind of hung up on what things look like, right? I mean, I could tell story after story of officers doing the right thing at my agency or others, but the administration was more concerned of what it looked like. And I know we've got to get away from that, but I have a theory. It's not grounded in anything but my crazy mind. Is we don't see a lot of emphasis on Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or these grappling things because from afar, that looks kind of bad, right? We're on top of somebody, we're controlling somebody. But the alternative is we're hitting them with a fist, or we're having to shoot them, we're having to tase them. I've never understood why we don't embrace this, because what I found out, and you would be the expert here, Dr. Butler, is you can control somebody with just, I think you described 5 things in your book to learn immediately, but it doesn't take really an expert to learn these controlling mechanisms, because fortunately, most people we fight with are not highly trained martial arts people. Those folks tend to be very disciplined. They're not tend to be people we're running into in the streets. And not to say it couldn't have happened, but most people have no sense of this whatsoever. They're just fighting. They're like this spider lady that I had to fight with. And you can use some control tactics that it's not that difficult to learn to really, in my mind, decrease injury. You may be still writing the use of force report, but it's going to decrease the injuries that's going to occur. Do you find that to be true?
Yes, because there's no, again, when I talk about incorporated striking, the officer isn't throwing the strikes. The officer is making sure that they're remaining safe by controlling the distance between themselves and the subject. So absolutely, right? You're gonna really be protecting that person and yourself by gaining control of them and maintaining that control until that person decides they're ready to go in cuffs. So if we learn to sort of slow things down to a certain extent, I think it can certainly help. Obviously, circumstances dictate tactics. So my thing is, I don't think anything is an end all be all. There are limitations to a grappling based art in certain instances, right? Like there are certain environments where you don't want to, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't train it. I say under most circumstances, it's inevitable, right? Whether you want it to or not, the situation is going to end up in this close entanglement, and more than likely you all are going to fall to the ground, right? The other thing I want to say in relation to that is, even if you do come across a situation where this person is significantly bigger, stronger than you, or even superior to you physically, you can still be able to survive with these skills. So let's say you have, and I teach at a police academy, and I tell this to my my smaller officers and my female officers all the time, right? They may feel, okay, I try to, let's say I do get this guy down and I try to put him in side control. If he's 100 pounds heavier than me, he could just literally throw me off, right? And I'm like, yes, that is possible, right? What the level of training you have right now, someone superior in size may be able to throw you off. The more training you get, the more consistent you are, the less likely that is to happen. But there is a certain point where it's just we have to respect nature. But my thing is, are you any worse off with those skills? Even let's say this person threw you off and jumped on top of you. I have so much faith in the person with the years of grappling training on bottom of a guy twice their size, right? Than I do a person who has gone through our standard law enforcement curriculum. Why? Because they spent hours and hours and hours of time in these bad positions, in these inferior positions. So they're able to remain calm under the stress of having someone bigger, heavier, stronger than you on top of you. So it's the attribute that we must, consider here too. It's the attribute of getting used to being in that struggle in a relatively safe environment. So when it happens on the job, you're not panicked. You're like, I've been here before. I can control the distance. I can control the damage that the person can do to me.
Yeah, that was one of the first things that I was shown as my white belt self was getting beat up by 12-year-olds is they would put you in these very uncomfortable positions, and your default is to panic, is to exert more energy, but you're going to flame out very quickly, right? And and so to be able to get comfortable in that was a huge help. I laughed. I think I saw you post the other day about having goals of being able to go 5 rounds. Of these 5 rounds of training back to back should be an ultimate goal. And I'll never forget the first time there was 5 minutes. I'm sorry, 5 minute round. I thought, okay, how hard would this be? I watched this on TV. Yeah, until you do 5 minutes for the first time, you don't realize how difficult that is. And I eventually got to where I could do 4 or 5 back to back without taking a break. But people don't realize that. And this is a regressive skill. I'm just concerned, and that's why I'm glad you're on, is we give this training in the academy. It's not enough to really ingrain muscle memory in, but then we don't typically give it again, right? And there's a reason why people train in martial arts 2 or 3, 4 times a week, sometimes more, because it's that regressive skill. And so if you're obviously the answer is for individuals listening to this to go and pursue this to make sure they're prepared. But I think really this has got to be on our police leaders. We interviewed Chief Jim Franklin from Rochester, Minnesota. And the reason we interviewed him about a year ago is because I'll put the episode link down below the show notes, is because he not only coordinated with a local jiu-jitsu gym to train his entire department, but he went himself. And they eventually ended up, all belting together and moving up, and they trained together like that every day. So I thought that was so amazing. It shouldn't be amazing. We should have chiefs and sheriffs training with their personnel all the time. but it was such a unique story. I had him on. It was one of our most listened to episodes. I think it's because it was so interesting and so amazing that it's happening. But there's not a police department in the country that within earshot could not find a trainer or a gym to partner with them, probably at a discounted cost or almost for nothing. I train for nothing at our local gym because there's always gyms that want to train law enforcement. They recognize that. So if you're a leader listening to this and you recognize not only for yourself, but for your officers, you need to provide this. How should they go about finding that gym? Like when they look at gyms, I mean, you need to go a little deeper than Google because not every gym's the same. What type of questions should they ask that gym owner before they make that partnership?
Yeah. So for sure, the first step is making sure it's practical in terms of location, right? So this is why I say start with Google, right? Find what do you have in your area. And then from there, it's a matter of contacting that business and having that conversation. Oftentimes, you'll find that, depending on the size of the department, there's officers that do train in some of these gyms. So being able to, first of all, kind of see, right, there's anybody that's already in the law enforcement community that does train, I think is a big thing because they can bridge that sort of gap. But yeah, sitting down and having that conversation with that business owner and saying what your needs are, what your interests are. And I don't know many martial arts schools that don't have an interest in helping the law enforcement community, right? So I do think it will be a pretty seamless transition. I can give you a couple examples of this. I presented in Atlanta a couple years ago. I think it was that conference where I talked about this, my experience with this very thing. So the place that I train in my area, it happens to be literally around the corner from the police department. And this police department, I got connected with the chief. He liked me. So I started doing in-service trainings for them. The limitation was that that the agency is pretty small. They didn't really have much space for us to really get into any training. So I said straight up, hey, I train at the Jiu-Jitsu school around the corner. Maybe I can connect you guys with them, and then we can see if we can work something out. Long story short, we got to a point where we worked out where the owners of the Jiu-Jitsu school don't use the facility during the day. So they essentially they gave me a key and allowed me to train this police department during the day on the Jiu-Jitsu mats, right? And they were getting accreditation for their training. So it's just being able to find those connecting points and using that networking to make it work. If you don't have any foundation, again, it starts with a phone call, agency introducing yourself to the business owner and maybe setting up a meeting. Another thing I think to consider here, though, is the school that you select, right? Because not every martial art is necessarily going to be applicable for law enforcement, right? So you have to consider what are your needs as an agency. Ideally, talk to officers who currently train. Also, again, things like my book, my research. There's information out there to give these agencies context, right, from actual officers or former officers. So gathering that information, I think, is big, and just taking it from there. And if any agency is actually interested in something like that, I'm sure they can reach out to yourself or myself, and we can kind of help, guide them in that direction if they're really serious about that. But yeah, I think that's the bottom line.
I think that's one of the unfortunate things, because as a leader, there is no excuse. Like these gyms, by and large, are very patriotic. They're very pro law enforcement. They understand the issues we face. They understand that oftentimes our training doesn't meet what the demands are out there on the street. I mean, I haven't found any of them that will not work with you. Now, I mean, there's even some websites that I've seen where these martial arts folks are just there. It's for free. Like I'd be shocked if it wasn't significantly discounted or absolutely free, because that's just been my experience. And I know there's some online things. I'm a member of Gracie's Online Academy. I'll be honest, it doesn't really work for me because I'm just the only person here doing it. So unless I buy one of those silly dummies on Amazon, I can't really do much with watching online. But I guess that could be an option as well. Do you know of any online programs because I use the supplement. I don't use it primarily to do it, but there's just a lot of information out there. But with a lot of information, there's a lot of bad information. So is there any recommendations for online to supplement it?
Yes. So now I'm not going to call out any like specific organization, but again, I would say thinking about what is the aim of a police officer? You want to do you want maximum control, minimum harm, right? In that situation. And ideally, you really, we can go back and say this comes down to even our de-escalatory skills, right? Being able to have the confidence to speak up and talk this person down, right? But so for me, like I said, grappling based systems are paramount. Fortunately, there is a ton of online content nowadays related to that. If you look into like if you were to Google something like police and grappling, police and jiu-jitsu, you're more likely to find results that are gonna connect the law enforcement industry with the grappling based training, right? So I mean, I'd say it's really more down to you sitting down and doing your own research. I don't like to call out specific organizations. I'm not affiliated with a specific organization that actually does a law enforcement direct, but there are some out there. I think when we get too wrapped up in like specific companies, I think we lose the context here. I think it's more about the attribute, developing this attribute. So if you were to find any grappling based system, or you were to find an online platform that works for you, as far as the limitation that you're presenting with being by yourself, if you're in an agency, all you need is one other officer, right, who might also share a similar interest, and you guys can get together and really work that out and drill on your own time, right? So that's something to consider, but I don't think there's much of a legitimate supplement to person face-to-face training, right? Like if you have no other choice, you're in a really small area and there's nothing around, okay, go online. But I definitely think you really need to be in an environment where you're with another person and you guys are engaged.
No, and I tend to agree. And I really go back to this is really a leader's responsibility. They're going to have to answer for injuries or excessive use of force. So we've got to give all the tools and training resources to our personnel if we expect them to perform adequately. It's just not good enough anymore to give them the state minimum in a basic academy, then expect them to always perform exceptionally, because we sometimes put standards on these men and women that are just normal people that are really just not realistic. And so there's never been a better opportunity now than to do this. I find it crazy that it's not being done more. Once again, I had one chief on that I found doing it, but if somebody's out there, they can reach out to me, they can reach out to you, enable this for your personnel. Maybe you don't make it mandatory. I personally would, because people are worried about injuries, but just like CrossFit found, it actually created less injuries with that platform. What type of research do you see out there as far as training injuries or actually injuries to suspects? Because I have to imagine there's been some studies that say this is better to do than sort of the things we're used to doing.
Yeah, a lot of the peer-reviewed research is still in the early stages, but yes, from the data I was seeing, and everybody knows about the sort of the landmark, study with the man, I'm drawing a blank on Marietta. Is it Marietta, Georgia?
I think so.
Yeah. So their department did the big study having their officers train jiu-jitsu, and they found reductions in injuries to officers and injuries to civilians, right? So we see some of that. The peer review content is not as prominent right now for law enforcement, but that's something that I think is building more and more. But if I was to say, like, if I was to give advice to an agency in terms of what they're looking for, I think the big picture one is an ego-free environment, right? So you want to be in an environment where it doesn't seem like, and that doesn't mean that the school owner has ill intent. Sometimes there are just training rooms where the participants are just, maybe they're competitors and they get locked in. They may not necessarily be bad people, but when you're training with them, you're kind of worried about getting hurt. So you have to be careful about those type of environments. But so environment that the ego isn't there so much, but they are testing the training under resistance, right? So if we only work under compliance, we don't get that live energy, right? So whatever facility or agency might consider partnering with, there needs to be a component of live training for that area. Many businesses are even often willing to hold law enforcement specific programming. That's something that you can discuss. They may not offer it at that moment, but if you sit down and have a conversation and say, hey, look, I can provide X amount of officers if you can provide this time frame for you to train these officers. I mean, it's a win-win situation, right? For
Yeah.
both sides. And then you can go into police more specific tactics. Another company that comes to mind now that I want to sort of plug is Adopt a Cop. I'm not sure if you've heard of that. Adopt a Cop,
Yep.
BJJ.
Yep.
So that's a nonprofit organization where they'll fund officers to get training in jiu-jitsu up to blue belt. So that's another good organization that I think the agencies can take advantage of, or at least make their officers aware of, right? That training that they can engage in. But I agree with you. It should be an initiative on the side of the police leadership to say, hey, we need to at least consider what opportunities we have in this area. But the whole purpose behind me writing this book was the fact that unfortunately we are not there yet. I don't think we're there yet, where we have all of this leadership that's valuing this training. So due to that, this book was like a message to early career officers. And it's like, look, you're entering into a career. You need to value this training. You need to do this training from hire to retire. If you are swearing to serve and protect, that is a responsibility, right? So for me, it's like, okay, if your agency is not in a position to support your consistent training, here are some things to look at, right? So I cover here are some things to look for in a martial arts school. Here are some arts to consider. As you pointed out, what are some tactics? I just published a study this month, actually, and it was some of the content is in the book about the top techniques that officers recommended. So I essentially surveyed over 300 police officers who train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and I wanted their perceptions of the training. And I asked them if there were 5 techniques that you would recommend, what would it be? And control-related positions they went to the forefront, right? So knee on belly, side control, gaining control of the subject, which, by the way, is what's going to minimize harm. I don't have to strike him if I can keep him under control, right? So just things to consider.
Now, if you're just now joining us, we're talking to Dr. Jeremy Butler. He's the author of the fantastic book you have to go get called Stop Resisting. And I think it's, I got to give you credit, Dr. Butler. Obviously there's 30 million books on Amazon. Everybody's writing a book these days. But very few books, I think, will make a lasting impact on this profession. I think this book does it. It's a read for the novice. You don't have to be some master expert or martial arts guru. You could just be somebody interested or knowing you got to get better, and it's going to help you out. So I think you've done a tremendous service here. I can't thank you enough. So if people are listening to us, I'm going to give you the last word, and they're thinking, you know what? I want to be better today. We're coming up on January 1st. This episode is dropping the first week of January. So that's in the people's minds. I want to be better, both mentally. I want to be better physically. I want to be better prepared at work. Just give them quick advice on what they need to do to put that into action.
I think it comes down to just that, acting. One big thing for me is goal setting, right? So establish what you want. Like what is it that you want, and write it down. And there's actual research that shows when you write down your goals, you are more likely to pursue and accomplish them, right? Yep. So decide what it is that you want and be specific about it. Again, this is another area that I address in the book is how do you set goals, right? So you want them to be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, time bound, right? You've heard of SMART goals, right? So thinking about the big picture also, and then narrowing it down, right? So what is the long-term goal? Where do you see it in the future? And then what are the short-term steps that gets me to where I want to be? So if you want to get to that point where you are actively training, let's say 2 days a week in your control tactics, okay, what are the steps to get you to that point? And then start with step 1 and work at it. So write it down and get started. It will be my biggest advice.
Yeah, and I guess I would add to that, somebody will hold you accountable to that, right? And of course, writing down is part of that, but find somebody to hold you accountable to that, whether that's your spouse or whether it's somebody at work or whoever it is. So great stuff, Dr. Butler. How do they reach out to you for more information?
You can go to www.jeremybutlerphd.com, www.jeremybutlerphd.com. You can find a link to my book on there. It's also, if you were to just search Stop Resisting book or Jeremy Butler Stop Resisting on Amazon, it'll come right up.
Dr. Jeremy Butler, I can't thank you enough for being here. I think this is incredible information. We need to get this to the masses. Thank you so much for doing that. And if you've been watching and you've been listening, thank you for doing that. We'll see you next week.